Difference between localhost and the IP address. If bind a socket in Python to localhost 8200, this is accessible via this URL, but not this URL. If bind a socket in Python to x.x.x.x 8200 machine name 8200, this is accessible via this URL and this URL, but not this URL. I thought localhost meant this machine, and that using it would loop back to the machine's IP address, but it appears to be different IPs. Is 127.0.0.1 always a different IP address to the machine's IP address? Update. I understand that the actual numbers are different, but what does the loopback do? For example, Wikipedia says that pointing a web browser to the URLs, this URL or this URL will access that computer's own website. But that website will also be accessible on XXXX and presumably be set up with a single socket on XXXX, so how do both references work then? Conclusion. I think I finally understand that 127.0.0.1 and XXXX work like this. And not or. Thanks all for the help.
Every IP address on the system is independent and can be bound to by sockets separately, with the exception of the special address 0.0.0.0, which indicates to the OS to bind the socket to all interfaces. To answer your question, 127.0.0.1 is not just a different IP address to the machine IP address, it's a different interface as well. 127.0.0.1 should not be seen on the local network. It's a special internal IP address for the loopback adapter. X.X.X.X will be your Ethernet card. By the way, localhost is simply an entry in your host's file that points to 127.0.0.1. If you bind a socket to 127.0.0.1:8200, then only clients running locally will be able to access it, and only within this URL, or this URL, or DNS, or host's file entry that points to 127.0.0.1. A socket bound to x.x.x.x 8200 will only be available through this URL, or a DNS, or host's file entry that points to that. Binding a socket to 127.0.0.1 does not automatically make it available on the Ethernet interface as well. That's why you can't connect to x.x.x.x 8200. You can bind port 8200 to all available interfaces 0.0.0.0, then it should work. Other features of the loopback adapter. The loopback interface is a virtual interface. It's often used to allow programs to talk to each other on the same machine. It is not a way to reference the machine IP address. 127.0.0.1 is the IP address of the loopback virtual adapter. The other thing about the loopback adapter is that because it's virtual, it doesn't actually pass any packets through to the network card.
For example, Wikipedia says that pointing a web browser to the URLs, this URL, or this URL, will access that computer's own website. Slightly inaccurate. It may do so. Equally well, it may not bring up any website, and it is even possible to display a different internal website from what you get when you use your x.x.x.x address. 127.0.0.1 points to your own machine, but that doesn't mean it will behave the same way once it reaches your machine. If you want a non-technical analogy, you can consider them different doors into your house. They are both pointing to the same house, but they are not the same thing. It is possible for each door to take you into the same room, or they could take you into a different room. It is also possible to lock one door and not the other. When you configure a website, you specify which addresses to bind to, and quite often the answer is all addresses. That is equivalent to have all doors taking you into the one room. You can also specify the website to bind to one address only. That is equivalent to locking all doors except one. If you have two or more websites, you can bind them to separate addresses. That is equivalent to having each door going into separate rooms. An example of how both references work: my Windows 7 computer has IIS installed. When I go into IIS Manager and right-click on Default Website, it gives me a Edit Bindings menu option. Selecting that bring up a list of bindings. I have only one, but for IP address it has asterisk, which means IIS listens on all my IP addresses.
If you want to support the channel, please consider liking and subscribing.